Welcome to this edition of In Context TV. On this edition, we're going to be talking about the college tuition crisis and its effect on the American middle class. Now, Ken and I have been studying the rapid rise in college tuition, and the American families have been straddled with ever-increasing amounts of debt in the past several decades, and in a weakening standard of living with fewer jobs. Now, in the current economic depression we find ourselves in, families are going to have to decide whether they take on a huge amount of debt to send their kids to college, they're going to give up their retirement funds, or are they just not going to go to college at all? Now, what's your take, Ken?
If you look at the cost of college over the last generation, you have to come to the conclusion that the middle class in America has been subjected to a giant ripoff. Let me lay some numbers on you. A good private college in 1968 in America, total cost for 4 years to get a BA was about $16,000. Go back to that same college today. It's well over $200,000. $200,000 for 4 years.
That's a huge amount of money.
Incredible, from $16,000. To put it in perspective, we looked at the salary of a middle-level person in the federal government, the kind of job you might get out of college after a few years, a GS-11. Back then, in the late 60s, he was making about $10,000. Today, he's making about $50,000. Well, if his salary had been indexed since the late 60s for the cost of college tuition, it would be something like $130,000, $140,000. So wages have lagged way behind. Tuition's increased at a rate of almost 3 times wages. And you say, well, that's a private college. Look at the public universities. They're cheap, aren't they? Well, I looked at the University of Connecticut just the other day. A good public institution in the Northeast. Mm-hmm. And the tuition there now for 4 years for an out-of-state student is, guess what? $168,000. And if you're in-state, and it's very hard nowadays to get admitted as an in-state student.
It's very competitive.
Very competitive. It's still $100,000 for the 4 years. So as Gus said, you're wiping out the savings of middle-class parents. You're making them get second mortgages on their house. You're wiping out the savings sometimes of the grandparents. And the students, the poor students, are ending up in horrendous debts. The total student debt now, according to the New York Times, is about $900 billion in America today. That's more than the outstanding debt for credit cards.
That's a lot of money. Now, is there some kind of a standard rate to say, sort of like when buying a house, what kind of a house you could afford? Is there a standard rate to say what kind of a college you can afford? In relation to the average salaries of 1969, college was maybe 2.5 times your, or 1.5 times your average wage?
Well, if you look at that for each year, tuition, the gross salary of the GS-11 worker was 2.5 times the annual tuition at private school. Now it would barely cover 1 year at that school.
Wow.
So when you come out of school with a debt of $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 into the terrible job market that we know exists today,
right,
where you may end up taking a minimum wage job for $8 an hour, you're going to have a heck of a time. So what we're finding is that most students today are either delinquent or they're in default on their student loans because they're just being crushed by debt that they can't support in the current lousy job market.
That's right. So how did something like this actually happen? What was the precipice that caused the cascade to fall?
Well, we talked with Andrew Hacker, mm-hmm, who wrote a book with Claudia Dreyfus called Higher Education, ? How colleges are wasting our money and failing our kids and what we can do about it. And his take is that it's basically runaway costs at the colleges. For example, they've expanded tremendously their administration. And he gives the example of one well-known private college where over 70% of the people on staff at that school don't teach. And he also talks about how tenured professors, a privileged class, live in an alternative universe where sometimes they only teach 1 or 2 courses in a semester and are paid very handsomely, have a lot of generous housing benefits and other bennies, and have complete job security. He also looks at sports programs. He says that's a big cost loser for colleges and a reason why tuition is going up. He says the facilities that are constructed and the cost of maintaining teams rarely are justified in terms of what the schools are earning from them. Another gentleman took a look at the cost of colleges, Richard Vedder, who is an economist at Ohio State, and he wrote a book called Growing going broke by degree. And he came to a different conclusion. He said the principal cause for the rise in college tuition is the availability of borrowed money. That is government-backed loans to students, and the availability of second mortgages on houses have allowed people to keep financing education far beyond their means.
He's not the only economist. I know well-known economist Peter Schiff recently spoke about this on his radio show. And it's akin to the housing bubble because by guaranteeing loans and allowing loans way larger than someone should be able to afford, they were able to buy way more house than they should be able to afford. And that caused the increase in the housing prices to go sky high.
I think it's a very good analogy. And the housing bubble, as we know, has burst.
Yes.
And the prices are collapsing, but we don't see that yet in college tuition. Even this year, if you look, prices are increasing again.
Is there any sign of the so-called education bubble bursting?
It doesn't seem to be. It doesn't seem to be bursting yet. It is a big crisis, and I have been thinking about how we should deal with it. And one solution I have is that students who are getting crushed by this debt should be allowed to discharge their debt in bankruptcy.
That's right.
In recent laws, that privilege was taken away from this. And unless we want to have a generation of young people who are in debt peonage, they have to be allowed to go in bankrupt and discharge these horrible student loans.
Just like credit card loans are no longer dischargeable in bankruptcy. So if you're trying to pay off your student loans and your living expenses while you're in school with your credit cards, you're going to come out with double debt. If you can't get a job right away, you are completely hammered.
It's going to ruin the lives of people, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen. And there's another step I would suggest, and that is taxpayers should say to universities and colleges, if you receive our support in any way, you will have to roll your tuitions back to bring them into line with wages over the last generation. If you want any more taxpayer money, you're going to have to do that. If you want to do without it, that's your business. But American families have had to learn how to live within their salaries over the last generation. The college and universities, which are run by very smart people, I'm sure they can do it too. There were three pillars supporting the post-World War II American middle class: rising real wages, affordable housing, and access to college. And during this decade, we're seeing all three of these pillars disintegrate. And the middle class in America has to take control of this government, which has been run for years now by cartels of large corporations, and say, this country is going to be run to meet our needs, to meet our expectations, and not in the profit interest of this cartel.
Well, it's definitely an issue that we need to get to the bottom of, and quickly, because I think that it's going to only contribute to the demise of the American middle class even further than we've already seen in the past 25 to 30 years. That does it for this edition of In Context TV. To hear the full audio program with our interview with Andrew Hacker, please visit our website at incontextreport.com. And there you can read our blog, download podcasts, and comment on stories. We'd love to hear your feedback. For In Context, this is Gus Cantivero.
And Ken McDermott Rowe.
See you next time.
What is it good for?